All right, this is SoberNow. I'm Jim LaPierre. It's good to be back with you. Live streaming today on SoberNow's Facebook page. If you haven't been over there yet, please drop in, give it a quick like. You'll get notifications for our future streams and for other content. Broadcasting on Choose Help today. If you haven't been over to choosehelp.com, very cool resource. Tons and tons of free articles on addiction recovery and on mental health too. So, today's topic is toxic relationships, recognizing when we're in them and talking about how to get out of them. And as always, very much welcome your comments, your questions, your experience, strength, and hope. Would love to hear what's on your mind today, even if it's off topic. I welcome your questions and very happy to talk about any aspect of recovery from substance use disorder, recovery from trauma, and from mental illness. So let's launch into it. Typically, it's interesting to me to note that whenever we talk about relationships and recovery, we're almost always referencing romantic partnerships as opposed to any other type of relationship, whether that's family, whether that's friends, coworkers, or any of the myriad of other types of relationships that we have. We tend to be most often focused on romantic partnerships, perhaps because that's where many of us struggle the most. Any type of relationship, of course, can be toxic. And I want to start off by saying that we always have to differentiate what is toxicity as opposed to what is simply abuse. If we're living with domestic violence or intimate partner violence, that's a very different conversation with me. And if you're living with that, then my hope is that you'll reach out. If you're not sure where to do that, please reach out to me, jim@sobernow.com, and I'll help you get oriented towards local resources. But today we're talking about toxicity, and for many of us this is altogether too familiar. And there's a very important link here to just name early on, which is that it's actually a recovery expression that my friends in Al-Anon use quite a bit. What we lived with, we learned, and what we learned, we became. So growing up in toxicity predisposes us to gravitate towards the familiar, and unfortunately what's familiar to us is oftentimes folks who are relatively toxic. So toxicity is a place that many of us find ourselves in. We're wondering, how did this happen? How did I get here? Why does this keep happening? And so we're going to be talking about that and a lot more today. Of course, the additional link for many of us is being adult children of alcoholics and addicts. We have so many pitfalls that we just kind of jump into. The biggest being that we are excessively loyal people. We are people with high pain tolerances, and unfortunately, if we can tolerate something, we generally will. We are people who fear change, and so we tend to work very hard to maintain status quo, even when status quo is unfulfilling, unsatisfying, or even damaging. We reason or we justify by saying, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. We justify, we minimize, we rationalize why things are okay when they're clearly unhealthy. And that's the standard that I want to judge by. I don't want to apply morality or tell you that something is right or wrong. What I'd rather look at is what's healthy for you, what is not healthy for you. So many of us struggle with trust issues, and that is incredibly common, particularly in recovery. And I remind folks that the person we most need to trust is ourselves, because without that, life is terribly unmanageable. The way to build trust in self is to have a lot of accountability in our lives, folks that are holding us accountable for our goals, for the changes that we're seeking to make, and to have a great deal of mindfulness, which mindfulness to me really is just the need to pay attention to self. We are people who are highly avoidant. We are people who have mastered lying to ourselves. So we need to combine a greater awareness of self so that the things we do subconsciously can become conscious choices. And again, we need accountability because we need folks checking in with us, making sure that we're following up, and checking our blind sides, making sure that we're not falling back into patterns of addictive thinking. And in the case of toxic relationships, checking in with us to make sure that we're not making excuses for our partners or for our family, because we tend to excuse bad behavior, we tend to make things or make people feel better after they've hurt us, and none of these serve us. So having rigorous honesty with self allows us to listen to what our intuition dictates. Too often we're going back and forth between our head and our heart, and we're looking for a softer, gentler reality, when in truth we could just be listening to our gut feeling and just knowing what we know. Frequently when folks struggle with anxiety, I will say to them, if we're going to get to a place where we're not perpetually overwhelmed, we need to be able to relate to ourselves in a healthy way, which means unlearning a lot of the lessons of our family of origin, a lot of the lessons that we were taught in abusive relationships, and come to a place where we can be fair and respectful to ourselves. Come to a place where we notice the contrast between what advice we give and how it is that we live. It's not hard for us to spot toxicity in other people's lives, but oftentimes we're not even looking for it in our own. I always encourage folks to pay careful attention to communication styles, because in a toxic relationship, what I'm looking for is hostile communication. But sometimes hostile communication or even abusive communication can seem very subtle. So passive aggressiveness in a person's communication style, a lack of integrity, a lack of taking responsibility. Sometimes even sarcasm is a real key to toxic communication, because sarcasm is oftentimes watered down anger. A person who mocks you is behaving in a way that is toxic. And of course, a person who gaslights you. Gaslighting is the go-to for narcissists, where there's something that's insulting or hurtful, but stated in such a way that when we say to them, that makes me angry, that hurts me, they phrase things in a way that gives them plausible deniability. That isn't what they meant, that isn't what they were saying. And this preys upon our propensity for self-doubt. We don't just second-guess ourselves, we 40-second-guess ourselves. And that leaves the door open to a whole lot of manipulation and a whole lot of controlling behaviors, which is something that we need to be acutely aware of. Oftentimes when a person is very insecure, very inhibited, they feel easily threatened. And so particularly in dating relationships, if you find that your partner is overtly suspicious, if they're the type to make accusations when what they really want is reassurance, these too are ingredients for toxicity. Any type of lying is a clear engagement in toxicity. Relationships that are one-sided are most often toxic. And this too is very difficult for us, because we're people who are far more comfortable giving than we are receiving. There's much more vulnerability involved in receiving. And so for a lot of us, I often think of Shel Silverstein's book, The Giving Tree, where everything is just taken and taken and taken until there's nothing left. If you're in a toxic relationship, you might find yourself frequently saying, "I'm just tired," which is almost never true. It's a minimization where we say that we're just tired when what we really mean is that we're drained. We've given and given and given and gotten little or nothing in return. Sometimes, especially in a toxic relationship, there'll be a small amount given back, a very, very small amount. I've referred to this as giving me a few crumbs. The controlling or abusive person would recognize that if it's 100% one-sided, then I might give up on this relationship. And so sometimes there's just enough to keep you going. And this too is something that requires a lot of honesty with self, because we need to value what it is that we're giving, which people like me have a tendency to devalue the good that we do and exaggerate the harm that we do. So having some outside input is really helpful here, And having some people in your life, even if it's just a couple of folks that you really trust yourself to be vulnerable with, that can give you some outside opinions on what it is that you're experiencing. Again, if you find that you're making excuses for their behavior, whether that's a partner, a family member, or a friend, then please look closely at that. If I have to make excuses for it, it's probably bullshit. It's probably hurtful behavior. It's probably something that doesn't belong in my life at all. I'm going to pause real quick just to check the feeds. Again, very much welcome your questions and comments. Would love to hear what your experience is on this topic. And, okay, let's keep rolling. I always spot the feeling of obligation. This is very common, especially for adult children of alcoholics and addicts. And I will ask people to consider where they learn that, because typically the folks that we feel obligated to are the very people that taught us that sense of obligation, that sense of excessive loyalty. As ACOAs, we tend to be loyal to people who are disloyal to us. I will often hear from folks things like, but it's my mother, it's my father, it's my sibling, and it underscores this idea that there's really nothing to think about, that this has to continue, this has to be perpetuated. And I will simply respond to that by asking, who do you want to feel obligated to you? And in virtually every case, they'll say, well, no one. And I'll say, right. We don't want people to feel indebted to us. We don't want them to feel that they have to relate to us at all. But oftentimes, that's exactly where we get stuck. In other cases, the go-to that I hear from folks all the time is, but I love them. I will oftentimes quote Tina Turner. Her song, What's Love Got to Do With It, was a really popular ballad 30 years ago. But it's an important message. The song, What's Love Got to Do With It, is actually a song about domestic violence. It was her marriage to Ike Turner and their pattern of her experiencing abuse from Ike, his apologies and his re-attestation, I love you so much, please don't leave me. And when she wrote this song, What's Love Got to Do With It, what she's referencing is, what does loving me have to do with abusing me? And I think that's a vital distinction, of course. Other things that I hear from folks, but this is so much better than my last relationship. Yep, and I bet you the next one can be even better. Again, if I have to make excuses for it, it's bullshit. Minimizations that I hear a lot. But it's not like he hits me or anything. Good. I'm glad that he's not violent. But toxicity comes in countless forms, and abuse comes in many forms. And so just because something is less horrible than what we've experienced in the past, that doesn't mean that it's good. Other things that I hear from folks, it's not their fault. Their last girlfriend really messed them up. And I have a story that I often tell. When my daughter was 13, she asked me out of the blue one day, she said, Dad, do you ever notice that everybody's ex is crazy? And I laughed and said, yeah. And she said, well, why is that? It doesn't seem plausible. And I said, it's not. When we're not willing to take responsibility for our own failures or our own character defects, and we blame other people and use these very categorical ways of dismissing them, and really what we're doing is absolving ourselves of responsibility. I often hear from folks excuses that sound very plausible. And they'll say to me, it's not their fault. They're very mentally ill. It's not their fault. They're in active addiction. It's not their fault. They come from a horrible family. It's not their fault. They've survived a lot of trauma. And there's a distinction that I always want to make there, which is there's none of those things excuse hurtful behavior. They may put it in an important context, but it doesn't absolve a person of responsibility. If they behave this way while they're drinking, it doesn't take away any of their responsibility because they were drunk. It doesn't take away any of their responsibility because they happen to be mentally ill. There's lots of ways in which folks may struggle to have self-control in a healthy way, but it doesn't ever excuse hurtful or toxic behavior. Sometimes I think of toxic relationships as being akin to any other type of investment that we might make. So the story that I sometimes tell is, 20 years ago I took an interest in day trading. And you get to learn some pretty painful lessons when you dabble in the stock market. So I would buy a stock because I believed that it was going to go up in value. And then, of course, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it actually goes down. And it continues to go down while you hope that it will come back. It'll at least come back to its original value, maybe even increase in value. But if it continues to go down, what I found myself saying was, well, I can't sell it now. I'd be taking a huge loss. I have to wait and hope that it improves and gets better. And this, of course, is an illusion. That loss has already happened. I just haven't cashed out. Something very similar happens in toxic relationships where we feel that we've already invested so much and we insist on getting a return. And this is when, particularly in a romantic partnership, when things are likely to become escalated and more problematic. When we both feel that we've invested so much and we demand a return, we stay in despite further losses. We stay in despite the fact that there's a point at which we're really just taking turns hurting each other. And the possibility of anything good coming from this is increasingly diminished. So being true to ourselves as opposed to being excessively loyal is the avenue that we need to explore. But particularly when this is an ongoing pattern in your life, the idea of starting over is enough to keep an awful lot of us stuck. The idea that it may not be any better in the future keeps us stuck. So I'm always encouraging folks to take stock. I'm a big fan of introspection. I cringe whenever people tell me that they're going to, quote unquote, figure it out, because figuring it out is usually something that you do alone, inside your head, and we still need to treat that like it's a bad neighborhood. Introspection, by contrast, is a way of taking stock emotionally. It's a way of noticing what hurts, what are the needs that I have that aren't being fulfilled, and how can I get those needs met? Because that is still my responsibility. We tend to approach family and romantic partnerships as though if our partners and the people in our lives are doing what they're supposed to do, then we'll feel good, we'll be happy, we'll be fulfilled. But all of those things are my responsibility, not anyone else's. The people that I choose to have in my life add to my happiness, add to my joy, add to my fulfillment, but they are never responsible for those things. And we still, in our culture, have so many bad ideas about what an ideal partnership is, about what an ideal family provides. And as adults, the individual is always responsible for all of those needs, and we have the responsibility of asking for what we need. And particularly if you come from a toxic family, the idea of that level of vulnerability might not only seem impossible, it might seem undesirable. And the simplest things that I've learned in relationships are simply being able to state what my needs are and noticing that my partner was very willing to meet those, but my struggle was to feel worthy and deserving. My struggle was to allow the kind of vulnerability where I would simply have hope and take the risk of disappointment by asking very simply and directly for what I need. Hey, thanks for writing in. In my growth, I'm noticing the depth of levels to every experience. I struggle to differentiate and not make excuses for myself. How can I fill up drained cups when I feel stretched so thin? That's a vital lesson. I'm glad that you're learning this. I love the expression that you can't pour from an empty cup. We need to have people in our lives that don't just take from us. Of course, when people that we care about are hurting, this has been particularly true through the course of the pandemic. We see so many of our loved ones with unmet needs, and we want to just give and give and give. But this, of course, is not sustainable. We need to allow others to give to us, and that means tolerating vulnerability. It means having an awareness of self, because in order for me to get my needs met, I have to know what those are. Making excuses for self is yet another reason to have a high level of rigorous honesty with self and to have a high level of accountability. I need to have people in my life that are willing and able to challenge me. If I'm the only one monitoring me, things are not going to go well. No matter how much we grow and heal in recovery, we still have an addictive mind to some extent that can easily minimize and justify and rationalize what are really unhealthy things for us, but that make us feel good or bring us some amount of pleasure or allow us to avoid things that we find stressful or painful. So these are all just things that I think really are easier to spot through journaling. I always want to encourage folks to bring things out into the open, whether that's through conversation with good friends, whether that's through creating artistically, musically. Journaling, quite literally, is a great way to get on the same page with yourself. Things look different when we bring them out into the open. They're more amenable to change when we bring them out into the open. When all we do is think about them, it tends to be circular. There's very rarely a resolution. There's very rarely a change. When I write about something, I'm quite literally using a different part of my brain than when I just think about it. And then when I speak about that issue with people who support me, I'm literally using another part of my brain. And so I think of it as coming at the same problem from different dimensions and utilizing different tools and different resources to getting the outcome I most want. So when we find that there are toxic people in our lives, most often a person who is toxic is not willing to change. It is perfectly appropriate and healthy to describe a change that you need to see or to ask for what it is that you want. But sometimes, despite our best efforts, we simply have to remove people from our lives. If there are folks that you find you have to walk on eggshells around, if there are folks that you find you just really can't be yourself around, then chances are this is somebody who just doesn't belong in your life. And I want to underscore the fact that you don't owe anyone an explanation. If having a person in your life causes you anything that's unhealthy, anything that's painful, it's okay to remove them. And you don't have to offer them an explanation, and you don't have to justify it. You can simply make that choice. We always feel like we have to have reasons for what we do, and we oftentimes feel that we have to explain ourselves, and you simply don't. It might seem a little bit trite, but sometimes I recommend a very old song by Paul Simon. He had a song that there's 50 ways to leave your lover. And while the song might seem a little bit flippant, I think what he's doing is simplifying something that we tend to treat as though it's very complicated. I've sat with hundreds of people who are trying to find the right timing or the right words to make a change in their lives. And I'm saying, that the timing really isn't all that important, and choosing the right words isn't important. Because if you're talking to a toxic person, it's not as though they're really going to hear you anyway. So it's okay to simply do what's best for you. And then when you've made that change, when you've removed those people from your lives, when you've removed those situations from your lives that are toxic, this is a really good time to regroup, because chances are this is not the first time you've encountered something that was toxic. It's not the first time that you stayed in a relationship too long. And we want to be able to evoke different outcomes, better endings, better developments, and healthier, more sustainable relationships. So I think what that really requires of us is, again, a lot of introspection. Instead of getting into your head, get into your heart. What are the needs that you have that haven't been fulfilled? What are the types of patterns in your life? Do you tend to gravitate towards the same type of people? Do you tend to date the same type of people? And what's going to be different going forward? The most important aspect of which is, what is it that I'm going to do differently in the future? What are the mistakes? What is my part in things that have evoked unhealthy outcomes? And so what can I do to best ensure that the relationships I have going forward are fulfilling and helpful? Eleanor, thanks for writing in. What do I do when insults keep coming despite my love? I'm so sorry. I'm a fan of simplicity, and I advocate vulnerability. And so when someone insults me, if I'm at all invested in the relationship, if I want for things to get better, I simply say to them, it hurts me when you say things like that. And if a person is healthy, if they're someone who's invested in a relationship with me, then they have a willingness to look at how their actions and their words affect me, and to do so with greater sensitivity going forward. If a person is hurtful to me and they're apologizing, then to me what that means is that they regret what they've done, but they're also implicitly promising to not continue to do that. It's always funny to me that for all of my training and education, I most often quote Facebook memes. And so the meme that I'm thinking about right now is that the best apology is changed behavior. I wish that loving someone had the power to change them. It does not. Tolerating hurtful behavior is always a bad idea for two reasons. The first is whatever we don't object to, we are acquiescing to. We're saying essentially through our behavior that it's okay to treat me that way. And what happens is that we stockpile resentment. Resentment to me is past pain and past anger, and it's something that too often results in self-loathing. It results in depression. It results in anxiety. And I think of it as simply as this. In any given situation that you find yourself struggling in, ask yourself, if it were a friend in this situation, what would I say to her? And then whatever that advice is, whatever that guidance happens to be, is also true for you. It's the closest we can come to looking at our own lives objectively. When we look at them ourselves, of course, our emotions, our sense of obligation, all of our struggles affect our perception, our sense of self, and affect how we function in relationships. I've learned that the two most foundational relationships in my life are the relationship that I have to self and the relationship that I have with a higher power. All other relationships are built on that foundation, and if those two aren't healthy, if I'm not investing in them, then sooner or later none of the other relationships in my life work. So I hope that things get better for you. I hope they change for you. But more than anything, I hope that you're true to yourself. I hope that you'll be honest with yourself. And please know that it's really just a hopelessly outdated myth in our culture that loving a person, especially in a romantic partnership, that if we just stick with them and just love them enough, that they will get better. If they are looking to change, if they are working to change, if they show accountability, then there's every reason to have hope. If they simply continue to behave in a way that is hurtful, I urge you to turn your attention to yourself, get your own needs met, get greater support outside of your partnership or outside of whatever that relationship happens to be, and consider what are the changes that you need to make to take better care of yourself going forward. Okay, going to be wrapping up for today, but always want to invite you to connect with me. If you haven't subscribed yet, head over to YouTube. SoberNow has, 120, 130 videos on different aspects of recovery from substance use disorder, and those are a free resource. Please check them out. Please email me, jim@sobernow.com. Would love to hear your comments and questions. If there's topics that you'd like to see covered in future live streams, I would love to hear what's on your mind and what would be helpful to you. And please check out our site, of course, SoberNow.com. We have recently moved to a subscription service, so for less than $15 a month, you can access a ton of resources in two forms. The first one is for support from recovery and substance use disorder, and the second program is for people like me who are affected others, those of us who have loved ones in active addiction or early recovery. So please take excellent care of yourselves. Please connect with me. I will look forward to seeing you next week, and